One for you. Via Rail and the contract with Siemens that could have saved the Thunder Bay plant and given them 10 years of work. Do you have any comment?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that we need to think carefully about how we ensure that our public dollars, our tax dollars on infrastructure projects are putting Canadians and Ontarians to work. And so we see other jurisdictions do that quite successfully. We see, in Europe, we see in the States, we see in places like China, the workers there get the work to build their transit systems. And we should be making sure that the same thing is happening in Ontario and in Canada. So, what does that look like? It looks like taking, the step of putting together requirements for local content, both Ontario and Canada content when it comes to the tendering of these kinds of contracts.
Is that something your party's prepared to do as a private member's bill?
Well, certainly we'll look at it. This is something, when I ran my leadership campaign 10 years ago, my leadership campaign was about, and I shared this with the union last night, my leadership campaign was about exactly this. It was about utilizing, I'm from Steeltown. What my vision is use the steel, make the steel in Hamilton. Well, first of all, get the raw materials from Northern Ontario in the mining sector, make the steel in Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie and places like that, and have the trains and the rails, built here in Thunder Bay. This is something that is possible, and so it's something that I believe in, something we should have done a long time ago, and certainly we're prepared to follow up with that. It has been a part of my platform in previous elections, and it's something we need to think carefully about. We should be putting our public dollars to use, getting our workers, our plants like Bombardier, those contracts to build the infrastructure that we need.
How much of the situation is the company Bombardier themselves responsible? You look at the situation in Toronto. You say the word Bombardier in Toronto, and that's a pretty toxic word down there, just with the difficulty in receiving the vehicles shipped on time. And a major cause for that's been identified as the outsourcing of parts production to Mexico. How much of the responsibility for this situation should fall on the company?
Well, again, if there's no requirement by government to ensure that the content that makes up those contracts and those units, those streetcars or those bi-level coaches, if there's nothing that requires the company to ensure that the product has got a significant amount of Ontario or Canadian content, then they're going to source it from wherever. And so, we have to have a vision from the federal and provincial level that ensures that we're getting, the kind of quality product that we know that these very skilled workers here in Thunder Bay can provide.
And that's been at 25% content since 2008. Does it need to be more than that? What would it be under an NDP?
Well, so certainly we need to look at the percentages, but we also need to look at what the content looks like. So are we talking value in terms of the dollar value, or are we looking at labor hours? So I think we need to have a hard look at exactly what we're talking about when we talk about what local content looks like.
To clarify, you would have labor hours?
Well,
as a stipulation
I'm not saying that we've come to that conclusion, but I think we need to look at exactly what we're talking about and how we can ensure that local content or Canadian content requirements actually achieve what we want them to achieve in terms of providing work for the workers.
Is that done anywhere else, and do you have an impression of
Well, again, as I said, it's something that I've been thinking about, and certainly I'm looking at what all of the options can be. Right now, we know that the current situation is not working in terms of providing the contracts and the product that will keep this plant running.
Last week in Kenora, Minister Greg Rickford said that boosting the Canadian content route in Ontario might preclude work in the United States for the Bombardier plant here. What would your comment on that be?
I think it's ridiculous. The reason that there's a Bombardier plant down in the States is because they have local content requirements. I think whether you're building a subway or streetcars in Toronto or cars for subways in Montreal or in Vancouver, we should be putting Canadian workers to work with our Canadian tax dollars.
The nature of manufacturing facilities, this one in particular, they're fairly cyclical. I mean, 20 years ago, there was only a few hundred people working at this plant. Do you believe the situation now is just part of that cycle, or given automation and future manufacturing jobs, this is direct peril to that facility near Thunder Bay?
Well, you know, I think we have to look at what the context is in terms of the push for greater mass transit systems. I mean, I come from Hamilton. We're putting an LRT in Hamilton. There was just an LRT, ribbon cutting and going on stream in Kitchener-Waterloo. With the certainly the federal government has talked a lot about mass transit systems and the desire to bring more mass transit to Canada. Certainly, that's something I'm hoping that the provincial government will actually follow up on, even though they're taking us backwards by tearing up the existing plans and basically stalling off the process of getting these transit systems online. I mean, we had millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars invested. The TTC did in plans for the downtown relief line, for a meritorious smart track, and those things have been torn up by Doug Ford, which is just going to extend the time frame for these projects to for Mr. Ford's projects to now come online, and so that's taking us backwards in terms of timelines. Having said that, though, I mean, look, we have a certain requirement and responsibility to deal with the climate crisis, and mass transit is one way to get single-use or single-occupant vehicles off the roads and create good jobs, but also reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. So with that kind of broader vision and that that bigger picture in mind, we should be having more hope for the future of this plant, not less.
But given Bombardier's corporate history, do they deserve this work?
I think the workers deserve the work. At the end of the day, the workers deserve the work, and Ontarians and Canadians deserve to see our tax dollars putting our families, to work and providing good jobs for folks so that they can, provide a good life for their families. I mean, these are the kind of jobs where people can, they can buy a house, they can send their kids to college or university, they have benefits, they're able to, to contribute to the broader local economy. And I mean, let's not forget, the Bombardier jobs specifically are what we're talking about, but there's also supply chain jobs that are going to be affected by the slowing down of work at the plant.
On drinking water, why are you advocating for the provincial government to step in instead of the federal government to do more?
Because it's everybody's responsibility. The access to clean water is absolutely a basic human right. We all have responsibilities to ensure that we are in good faith trying to travel a path of reconciliation, and that's not just the federal government's responsibility, it's also the provincial government's responsibility. And what we see too often is finger pointing, and the finger pointing goes nowhere, and communities end up with boil water advisories for 25 years. I mean, it's unacceptable. So if the federal government isn't getting around to it, then the provincial government needs to get around to it and send the bill to Ottawa.
Is there a precedent for the provincial government to step in something like this specifically that's widely seen as a federal responsibility?
Well, do you know what? I think it's everybody's responsibility. I don't, and this becomes the problem. The provincial government says it's not our responsibility, it's the federal government's responsibility. The federal government doesn't seem to be moving at all fast enough to deal with these boil water advisories. I mean, 25 years? Really? 25 years of boil water advisories? And that's just the one community. We know that there are 80 or so currently in the province of Ontario that are facing the same situation. Maybe not for 25 years, but these are Ontarians. These are people who live in Ontario. So Ontario has a responsibility to make sure that every Ontarian has access to clean water. That goes back to that, that fundamental idea that we all have a responsibility, not only in terms of reconciliation, but in terms of making sure that people's basic human right to clean drinking water is fulfilled. And so these folks are Ontarians, they're Canadians for sure, but if Ontario can step in and get the job done and send the bill to Ottawa, then that's what we should be doing.
Do you feel the federal government has failed on this issue?
Well, it's not what I feel, it's what I see. The last 48 hours, it was shocking to me. And it's not the first time I've traveled in the far north. I've traveled to communities before. But to hear, from people who are worried that they can't bathe their children because the water is literally toxic, that's not acceptable. To live that way for 25 years, where else would we accept something like that? We shouldn't be accepting it. And so, as I said at the onset of my remarks, whether it's the current provincial and federal government, or whether it's the governments before that, or before that, or before that, it's far too long that these advisories have been in place, and it's far too long that these communities have been expected to drink from bottled water or reverse osmosis systems that are not always providing enough access to water. In Attawapiskat, we were hearing that they're not even receiving enough clean water to meet the needs of their community at this point. That's just not acceptable.
This is an issue in other provinces as well, then. Is it time for all provincial leaders to step in on this?
Well, you know what? It's a national shame. It's a national shame for us as a country, and for each and every province. It should also be considered a shame, provincial shame or territorial shame as well. There's decades we have not stepped up to the plate and to do the right thing by these communities.
With the Niskandiga case in particular, the federal government had been moving forward on getting that plant's drinking water, or that community's drinking water system improved. The contractor's been removed from the community. What exactly can the province do differently in that case?
Well, I mean, what we were happy to hear from the chief in Niskandiga is that their new contractor that's on site has a completion date ready for the system, which they're expecting to be completed sometime in October, mid-October, and that's a positive development. In terms of the details of what went wrong with the former contractor, I have no knowledge of the details there. I understand it's in a legal process right now, but to have to be delayed by a contractor that wasn't apparently fulfilling the expectations of the community. It was just a step backwards. And one of the things that I was talking to Chief and Council about was the tendering process and the necessity to have a look at the capacity of the companies that put bids in and whether or not they can actually deliver on the contract.
In Attawapiskat, one of the federal ministers did a tweet about how wonderful the water was in Ottawa, and Adrian Sutherland, Chelsea Jane Edwards, and others have made a Twitter storm out of this, inviting her to come to their community and drink water. How long do you think Ottawa, Toronto, or Thunder Bay would tolerate a boil water or advisory for our water?
Well, I mean, this is exactly why I'm here today. It's to try to continue to push to the forefront the horrifying situation that these communities are facing, and to remind decision makers, remind people that have the power to make a difference about what's going on there, to not allow them to simply go back to their comfortable life and not feel a requirement, not feel a necessity to act on the challenges that these communities have been facing for far too long, because exactly what you said is the case. We would not accept that anywhere else. We wouldn't accept it here in Thunder Bay. We wouldn't accept it in Ottawa. We wouldn't accept it in Hamilton. These situations have to be dealt with. And as I said, there's a lot of talk, but there's not enough action.
What are the actual steps that need to be taken in order to resolve the water crisis?
Steps actually need to be taken. at the end of the day, steps need to be taken, and they are not being taken. That's the challenge that we have. That we know that the advisories have been in existence in some cases for a very long time, and yet there's no resolution. The treatment plants are not being provided. The training, perhaps, of community members to run those plants is not where it should be, and we need to resolve that. You know, the problem is that we you know, and a state of emergency is declared by a community. In fact, we had planned for our tour here in Northern Ontario based on the Attawapiskat state of emergency, and we were planning on coming to the north regardless. And then while we were kind of getting ready to travel, another community declared a state of emergency. And so, you know, it's a continuous situation that needs action. And when I was in Attawapiskat, the council members were clear and the community members were clear. We don't want talk anymore. It's talk, talk, talk. They have people come and visit, and there's a community conversation, and then people leave, and nothing happens. And the systemic issue of access to clean water is not addressed. And of course, we've seen other challenges that Attawapiskat's been facing, that where there's been foot dragging in terms of getting these issues resolved. They had the diesel plumes on the underground. Phase 1 of the cleanup has occurred. Phase 2 still is waiting. So it's almost like they feel that they're out of sight, out of mind. Out of sight, out of mind. And that's why I'm here today as well, is to try to remind folks that these are Ontarians and they are Canadians, and they deserve so much better than what they've been getting in terms of attention to their very, very serious problems.
With infrastructure, critical infrastructure like water treatment plants becoming increasingly at risk as a result of climate change, increasing prevalence of forest fires and such, what needs to be done to protect this infrastructure in the communities?
Well, I mean, what we don't do is cut the firefighting budget by 50%, which is what Doug Ford did. What we don't do is cut the funding for conservation authorities to do floodwater management, by 50%, which is what Doug Ford did. So Doug Ford is dragging us backwards when it comes to ensuring that communities have the capacity to address the impacts of climate change. And one of the things that we've said for some time now is that when we are talking about climate change, and even with the former government's cap and trade program, one of the things that we were trying to get the Liberals to do at the time is to acknowledge that northern communities, whether it's a community like Thunder Bay or whether it's a community like Attawapiskat, the effects of climate change are going to be greater in communities like this, and we need to acknowledge that and set aside, funding to ensure that that the communities can be ready to deal with the impacts. But what we're seeing from the Ford government, the Liberal government wasn't doing a great job, but the Ford government is taking us even further backwards.
Looking at the forest fire situation this year, we've had Pekanjicum evacuated twice because of forest fires. The most recent case, you had to have up to 2,000 community members sent 2 provinces over because there weren't enough host communities in Ontario willing and able to step forward. What do you think can be done to make sure that communities are able to accept people, and whether that needs to be some kind of provincial framework or some form of formal process in place so we don't come to a situation where you have people that need to be evacuated but have nowhere to go?
Sure. Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's important to thank communities like Thunder Bay that stepped up to the plate. I was in Sulakaut yesterday, and we were talking with some folks that had been evacuated from Kiwewin, and so we were thankful that Sulakaut stepped up to the plate in Geese Riding, communities like Hearst and Kapuskasing, and of course Timmins as well. All of those communities that did step up, we are very, very grateful, and I'm sure the folks from the evacuated communities are very grateful as well. But we shouldn't have to be sending folks 2 provinces over to provinces like Saskatchewan. We should be able to make sure that Ontario communities are open to providing shelter and necessities of the communities that are being evacuated. And the Ford government, I think, was ill prepared and didn't have a plan in place. And hopefully they'll have learned from this experience and begin to create a roster, if you will, of host communities that will be able to, in the future, easily be called upon to take in folks when the forest fires get dangerous.
Should mid-northern Ontario have infrastructure in place as climate change continues and we expect fires to get worse?
Oh, well, there's no doubt, but the problem is that the communities can't take that on financially on their own. Whether it's communities in the far north or whether it's communities like Thunder Bay, we need the provincial government to step up and be a partner in shoring up infrastructure and in bringing infrastructure, to a level that's going to be able to help with mitigation. But we see the provincial government, Mr. Ford, going in the opposite direction. He's taking away resources from municipalities. He's taking funding away from communities and telling municipalities that they're going to have to, find the money somewhere. So he's dragging us completely in the wrong direction. And we know the municipalities have already been sounding the alarm bells that they don't have access to revenue streams to enable them to be prepared. There's just no doubt that the provincial government needs to be a partner with municipalities, but unfortunately, Mr. Ford sees things a different way. He doesn't believe that the provincial government should be partnering financially with municipalities.